SaaS Therapy.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of SaaS Therapy. My name is Todd Kirk, and I am your host, and I am joined by the magnanimous, the illustrious, the pontificating Casey Trujillo.
Wow,
Hey, Casey.
Todd. I'm going to have to look up some of those words just to know if you insulted me or if you praised me.
Pontificating means you talk a lot, so hopefully that's a good thing.
I'm still debatable if that was a good thing or a bad thing. All right. Well, Todd, I am excited for today's episode because one, I get to interview you, so that means I just have to ask questions. But two, I love the topic we are talking about. I was on LinkedIn and, always doing my research, doing my due diligence, making sure I'm staying up on the hot topics. And one CS leader put a post out there and they asked a polling question. They said, how do you feel your churn rate is in 2024 compared to this time in 2023? And I think it was about 73% of people who responded said they are worse or the same, and 2023 wasn't great for them. Only about 20% said that they're doing better. And I think the topic we are talking about is probably a reason why things are just getting worse when it comes to customer churn. So Todd, I have a question for you. And I know our audience might think it's simple in the answer, but who owns the value, the business value of the software, of getting the benefits that they are actually looking for? Who actually owns that? Is it the customer? Is it the SaaS vendor? Who owns it?
Well, I would actually say that I'm going to give the answer that everybody hates, which is it depends. No, that's not true. It's not that it depends. The real answer is that it is both. But the problem is that who owns what and when they own that becomes really, really confusing for people. So in the beginning, the SaaS vendor likely owns a lot of it. They have to help the customer understand the value so that they buy, right? I mean, understanding the value of the product, that is 100% on the vendor at the beginning. So that's really true. During the implementation phase, that's usually new audience members, new users, new people who have to understand. So again, explaining value and delivering value, that's 100% on the vendor. But once the customer has bought in to this idea, once they've bought in that this is my product and I need to use it, of course it's up to them to realize that value. And that is the big problem that I see, is that too often we are focused on just how do we renew, not on how do we deliver value. And the problem is there, though, is even if I were to say, well, I got to shift that. I got to shift on how I deliver value. You cannot force, no matter what you do, if you are a CSM, you cannot force your customer to realize value. They have to receive the results themselves. And that, I think, is the big disconnect. So that was a really long way of saying who owns it? Well, it depends on what you mean. If it means like getting them set up and understanding it, it's on the vendor. But actually achieving it, it's the same thing with my kids. I can't if I clean up their room for them, did they learn how to clean up their room? No. So you as the vendor have to make it so that the customer is empowered to do it on their own at some point. And the real question is, when does that transference happen? Is it early in the relationship or late in the relationship? And if it never happens, your likelihood of renewing goes down pretty heavily.
I love that insight because I believe most SaaS vendors treat it as if they own the business value throughout the entire life cycle of the customer. Unless you're small ARR, then you don't really matter to me. And hopefully my digital scale thing, you click on it and you look at it, right? I mean, let's be honest, that's the approach that most SaaS vendors are taking. So Todd, what are the challenges that the SaaS vendor is facing in empowering or deputizing, I've heard you say that word, the customer and actually getting their own business value? What are the challenges that the SaaS vendor, customer success, customer education is facing in doing that?
Well, I think the first thing is I like to say that solving the customer's problem is the problem. And so I think a lot of times what we do first is we miss the point of what the problem is that is preventing the customer from being successful. And when I say problem, I mean what the problem that is preventing the customer from being successful. A lot of times, like, we understand the problem that our product solves, right? Like,
Right.
Slack solves asynchronous collaboration. Zoom solves having to travel so that you can, meet virtually online. Excel solves being able to do basic math calculations and doing all the way up to really advanced forecasting and things like that, right? Excel is about working with data and cells. So the product itself, most of the time, you probably have a really good idea around what that product is supposed to do, and yet the customer still isn't doing it. So what I'm saying is solving the customer's problem is the problem. I mean, is what is the problem that's preventing the customer from being successful and actually achieving it? Because, if you were to just think about the SaaS world in general, the customer, they bought it thinking that they were going to get value, right? I
Right.
mean, they anticipate receiving value from you, and they want some measurable result that they're trying to get, and yet they aren't doing it. So you're like, why? You told me you wanted to solve this problem, and then you aren't solving the problem. So what is actually causing that to happen? And that is probably the question that I think is too often ignored, and it's the reason why customers don't take ownership of their own success.
Well, what is it, Todd? Quit explaining the problem is the problem and tell me what the problem actually is.
Well, I will, Casey. But I want to make sure everybody's following along with me. So, okay, so if that's the problem, what is it?
That
I would say
makes total sense.
good. I'm glad. Thank you. I would say it usually boils down to three things. One is the customer's overwhelmed, and I think we oftentimes take that for granted. And I'll talk about what that means a little bit more here in a second.
Okay.
Two is they're under equipped. So they don't have the right tools to actually do something about this problem. And three, they don't know how. They don't have the right expertise to be successful. So I usually think
Mm.
it rolls down to those three things. One, being overwhelmed. Two, not having the right tools and feeling under equipped. And three is not having the right knowledge or expertise to actually get the job done.
Mm. Let's go through them. Walk me through number one.
All right. Well, here's the dirty little secret that I think most CSMs don't realize when it comes down to their actual working in the SaaS world, and that is that when it comes to B2B software, they are not the only tool. So if you are a CSM, first thing you got to understand is that when I say your customer is overwhelmed, their world does not revolve around you the same way your world revolves around them. So, as
Mm.
an example, if I work for an organization that has 2,000 plus employees, I'm likely deploying somewhere in the realm of 187, maybe over 200 or 300 different SaaS applications to my end users. That's crazy. Every end user inside the business likely has access to dozens of different tools that they're supposed to use on a daily basis. And if I'm an administrator who's being tasked with supporting a tool, I don't just support that one tool. I likely support many others. And that is what I say when I talk about being overwhelmed. So if you just take a step back, if you're a client success manager, and put yourself in the shoes of your point of contact that you work for, you are not the only person they interface with on a day-to-day basis. They likely have dozens of other vendors who also have CSMs who want their time. So if you are just imagine for a minute, if you are a point of contact who works with a CSM, if you met with every CSM you had, that would be your whole job, right? But
Right.
not only that, if that champion has to interface with someone in IT, or they are part of IT and they have to interface with other people in IT, they have to work with HR to make sure that people are trained. They have to work with new hires who come on so they learn how to use the application. They have to report information back to leadership to make sure that leadership understands what's going on. They have to work with power users, and they also have to intervene with people who are totally dark and not using the application. So, like, not only do they have to understand what you want them to do as a vendor, but then they have to figure out how to translate that into a complex organizational structure. And they also have to do that same thing with dozens of other software vendors at the same time.
And Todd, let's also be honest that you're describing actually a dream scenario, meaning that the person you're working with, their only job is software adoption at the organization. A
Right.
lot of people that's just an additional responsibility that they've taken on. They're part of IT and they're maybe doing internal trainings, or maybe they're running the service desk, and these applications just happen to fall under their preview, right? And so they're being asked to go above and beyond and doing that. They might even have a day job besides this. So I think also what you described is even a perfect scenario that, hey, I only have to get software adoption for 13 applications, even though that's impossible. Usually it's not their only job.
Yes, that's true. And if it is their only job, it's likely because they work in a huge organization. So
Yes.
if you like, for the only companies that can afford to give someone that primary responsibility just to own success and adoption of a tool internally, that's usually going to be a really big company. So let's say you have like 40, 50,000 employees. And in that case, even still, most of the time it's like one, maybe two people in an entire organization to try to get 40 or 50,000 employees doing something. So if it is your job, you are overwhelmed because the only time you're able to dedicate a whole resource to a person is if your company is big enough to. And as a result, you end up having a massive amount of work because you have to now change the behavior and drive adoption for tens of thousands of people instead of just
Right.
maybe a few dozen or a few hundred. So yeah, either way, if you're smaller, you're likely it's not your only job. If you're bigger, it's your only job, but you are like one person in a sea of millions of people you have to try to figure out how to support. So it's
And
really,
you
really
think,
daunting.
and if you're like, I don't know, Todd, I don't know if that data is right. Just you're listening to this podcast. Think about your job and what you do every day. Do you use Outlook? Do you use Google? Do you use Zoom? Do you use Adobe? Do you use DocuSign? Do you use PandaDocs? Do you use Camtasia? Just think about your own job and then think, oh, yeah, I only use the bare minimum in most of those software applications. There it is. Like someone at your organization bought those software applications for you. You're a living example that you probably just scratching the surface of most of these applications that your own organization is giving to you. So, I mean, it's just as simple as looking in the mirror to see, oh my gosh, this is so true with myself.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges when it comes to technology in the enterprise is that there are so many SaaS vendors. Many of them do something super, super well. But in
Yeah.
order for me as an end user to know what those tools are, when I should use them, and how they're going to best support me, that's really hard. And so most tools rely super heavily on being just something that is like the end user can't live without. But that list of applications is really, really short. It's very, very small. And even if your tool is better than the way that the customer is actually doing it today, what the way they are doing things today feels comfortable. It feels familiar.
Mhm.
And change feels like a lot of work. There's a great quote that I love, which is everybody wants to change, they just don't want to do anything differently. And that's exactly what it's like. For most customers, they want the value, they want the change, but they don't want to have to do the work in order to make that change occur. And so as a result, they put it all on you as a CSM to make those changes, and that is literally impossible. Because you don't work for the company, you don't understand the culture, you aren't they don't really care what you do. They'll put it all on you. And it's like you are now in this trapped situation. If your goal is to say, I will force success on you, I will show up at your office, I'll fly to your locations, and I'll train all of your people. Well, maybe you can do that once if your customer is big enough and they're willing to pay for the service to have you show up.
Right.
But guess what? That's just a flash in the pan. I've talked to so many CSMs where it's like our usage always spikes when we do a training. But it's like, okay, so are you going to train every month for eternity? Right?
Right.
Because if you're going to just see a spike and then it's going to go back down to nothingness again, well, then like, what are you doing? And if it requires you to show up and do an online training or fly out on site to see a customer every single month forever, it's like, that's not a very good way to build out a really successful SaaS company. So you need to figure out a different way to approach that problem.
Yeah. It seems like for some reason, the way that we approach customer adoption is still stuck as if we're on prem. Yeah, I'll
Mm-hmm.
fly out. I'll do some training because software ain't changing until we come out with a new release, and that's going to be in a year or two, and then you'll upgrade. And we'll rinse and repeat, right? And unfortunately, we're applying the same methodology, but to a SaaS application that's changing every month. So Todd, that is point number one. Got it. I'm feeling what my point of contact is feeling now on the other end. You've helped me have that insight. Let's dive into item number two of why customers should own the value, but maybe don't.
Well, okay. So the second point comes to being poorly equipped. And so I would guess that most CSMs are probably saying right now, what are you talking about? I equip my customer so well. I'm the best at equipping my customer. I give them everything that they need. We have an amazing in-app walkthrough, right? We've built an amazing in-app walkthrough that less than 1% of your users actually click through. Okay, cool. Oh, so that's a whole separate conversation. But then you look at it and you think, okay, well, we built out an academy and we have tons of resources and all these get started resources are there, but nobody's going to them. And you're like, why is nobody going to them? So we built out a support team and people are calling in the support desk all the time. But then they're constantly calling the support desk and they never seem to get over it. And everything they're asking are how-to questions. And then, I, as a client success manager, I'm hopping on, I'm having strategic conversations with them. I'm sending them really cool links to ideas and I'm building out cool projects that we could do. We have this awesome community that a few of my customers go to every once in a while. So we think about we as a vendor think we are equipping our customers so well. Because everything I just said, most SaaS companies have at least some level of that type of support they're delivering.
Right.
But here's the dirty little secret. All of that revolves around you as the vendor and not around the customer. So again, go back to that same point. You are not the only part of their world. They have a bunch of other vendors who are doing that same thing. So if I've got 187 SaaS applications, that's 187 different academies I have to try to direct my users to. They don't know where to go find those. So I put them on YouTube, but then I put them on YouTube and I have no idea if anybody ever went and watched the videos that you put them up there anyway. And it's all mixed in with my marketing content and webinars that maybe you have to do with stuff that I didn't even buy. So the customer is now super frustrated because instead of giving them the tools that they actually need to be successful, we're just surrounding them with tons of different materials and then, asking them to figure it out. You sometimes refer to that as the IKEA problem, right? And the customer thought that they bought a couch, but you gave them 3 boxes with 1 million screws and little wood pieces, and then you got to figure out how to build it together. But the thing is, they didn't just buy the couch. They also bought the coffee table and 3 chairs and a TV stand and a dresser. And now their whole entire house is just filled with boxes that they have to try to figure out how to unpack. That is what I mean by giving them something that is, they thought they were buying a ready-to-go product, and really you just gave them about a bunch of pieces when it comes to actually driving success and adoption.
And Todd, just to kind of riff on what you're saying is, I feel like when we do that to the customer and the customer says, hey, I don't know what to do with all this, the burden is starting to shift back to the SaaS vendor. They're saying, hey, you're giving me too much information. I don't even know what to do with it. So where should I start? What should I do? Oh, hey, let's just start doing this. Now the burden has shifted because you made it too hard for the customer to do this. I got included on this email. There's a customer that reached out to their SaaS vendor, said, I want to get better adoption of your software. Please help me. And the response was 10 different links to 10 different sites and information that this customer possibly could go to. And the customer responded back to the SaaS vendor and said, what do I do with all this? That makes total sense. And now I see why the burden is shifting back to the SaaS vendor, because the customer's saying, I don't know how I could possibly do this, so I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Yeah. No, I mean, think about it. And this is the thing that is why the customer never takes ownership of the actual value realization. And that is that no matter if you provide all these resources, you give them a great academy, support experience, you have, great documentation, you send them all these different pieces. Well, regardless, they still have to follow through and read it all. Then they have to become the expert and they have to launch that tool out to their end user base. Then they have to help those users understand how it actually applies to them in their job. Then they have to figure out how those end users stay up to the job. Then they have to come up with a way to onboard new users, because guess what? Just because you implemented and launched it doesn't mean that new hires aren't coming on. And then they have to go back and report how well they did to their leadership. So even if you provide them all those resources, they can't put a program or a process in place around it. No matter what you do. And what's worse is if they got to go report to leadership, guess who they have to go to get that information to see how well they did? They have to go to you. So again, now it's on you to be able to say, yes, all the efforts we did are making an impact and you're actually getting the value out of the software that you wanted. So that's what I mean when I'm saying you don't really equip them with anything. You just give them a bunch of random pieces and hope they build out something awesome. Like the problem isn't just that they have your software and that your software is deployed. The problem is that the customer has connected the dots to how they're going to receive the value, and they know how to change their users' behavior in order to realize it.
Yeah, and I'd say before we get to your point number three, has been so fantastic, Todd. Is I think SaaS vendors, the customer success team, customer education team, also fall into a false positive. And what we mean by that is there are some customers that your champion there is just amazing. They're a go getter. They put all those pieces. They read all the pieces. They put it together. They convince their communication team to send out. They get the data from them and they make it work. And you're like, oh, if I could just have everyone work like this customer. And then you have this customer be highlighted in your community platform and they talk about what all the things they did. All it signifies to the majority of your customers is if I want to make this happen and get those results, it's going to take a lot of hard work. So I have to go justify hiring another person for your software, or I have to go find another software that's easier. That's usually what takes place. And so again, going back to the point where we started, why is churn the same or worse? Is because people aren't attacking this challenge in a different way. They're not looking at the data. They just can't be. Because if they are, they would look at all the data and say, we are not reaching 90% of our user base. So makes total sense to me, Todd. What's point number three?
Okay, so this is the really interesting part, and it goes back to this point of what about the companies that don't have that are really good at being full PLG? They don't have a CSM assigned. The customer gets in there, and they're really successful. In my experience, if you have a really good product marketing message on the front end, that's going to get people who are motivated to go figure out how they're going to achieve the value. But what's fascinating is I think the people who buy stuff in full PLG are only successful because they're already motivated. And the problem is in most enterprise sales, especially if you have a seller involved ever, right? If you have a seller who's involved ever, that means that there is someone down the line who is not sold to is going to be expected to use that software. So when it comes down to the expertise problem, unless you're 100% selling PLG deals, and that's only going to happen generally in smaller deals anyway, right? Nobody's buying 100,000 licenses on a credit card and never talking to a human, right? Like that doesn't happen. So unless you only sell to small businesses, and where 100% of the people who are buying the software are also the user base, which is rare, you need to think about the expertise gaps that the customers have. The first one is change management. So obviously we've been talking a lot about driving adoption and whose job that is. And the customer needs to get the result. They have to change their behavior. You cannot force them to change their behavior, no matter what. You can train them. You can tell them they're great. You can give them pep talks. That's not going to. They have to be the ones who change behavior. And usually the person you're working with, your point of contact, is the gatekeeper between you and the end user. So, I mean, you're not meeting with every end user all the time. I mean, maybe they let you do training every once in a while, but it's not like you're having regular sync calls with every end user at the customer. So the change management process is a big pain point that we need to get better at training customers on. The second thing is business acumen. So this is a big gap that I think we sometimes miss. You as a CSM, if you do not have business acumen and understand your customer's business and how they operate, that's going to be painful. But the fact is, a lot of the times, the people who are tasked to own software, they don't have business acumen. They may not, and that sounds a little bit harsh, but like just back up for a minute and just think, like what percentage of your employees at your own organization understand what the strategic imperatives from the executive team is that year.
Right.
I mean, you may, let's say you sell to a public company, they probably have 10Ks and there's investor decks and presentations done by the executive team to the public market. 99% of your point of contacts haven't read those. They don't know even what the executive team is saying. So they've been given a project, they've been given a task, and they may not understand what leadership inside their own organization cares about. So one, you got to teach them how to change, but two, you have to teach them how to like be savvy about how their business is going to unlock the value. Third is marketing. Most of the time you're working with someone who is in IT. They're not used to talking
Yep.
to people. They don't have like the ability to write good email copy. They don't know how to like deliver a really fun and engaging webinar. And so like training them on how to promote the software internally is going to be challenging. And the same is true of training, right? They may not be good at training. They might be great project managers, but a lot of times they aren't. Like they're not necessarily thinking through milestones and when they're going to accomplish specific projects. And so like it's important for you to equip them with the know-how of like a roadmap of where they're going and what they need to do. And then the last thing is like they may not even know how to manage a meeting appropriately. So you end up
Mm,
meeting with them frequently and then they just feel frustrated because there's no value
right.
happening because they don't know how to run a good meeting. So if you're not good at those things, which is a problem. Like you as a CSM should have all those capabilities. You should understand all those things, but your customer may not have those things. And if you don't have them and they don't have them, it's the blind leading the blind, and you're just going to end up in really weird, bad places. I sometimes use this parable here, brainstorm, which is it's a riff on the old like teach a man to fish idea.
Yeah.
And so you can teach a man to fish, right? But I guess the normal one is give a man a fish and he'll eat for a day. Teach a man to fish, he'll eat for a lifetime. I would say it's give a man a fish, he'll ask for more fish. If you teach a man to fish, he'll still ask for more fish because fishing is hard and it takes a long time. So like that is the piece that I think we sometimes miss is like learning how to do these things and feeling confident in your ability to do those things. That doesn't mean you're going to do it because it still might be hard. And so it's still easy to push the ownership onto you as a CSM. So we have to figure out how to tackle all three of those problems. You can't just give them the knowledge and the expertise. You also have to give them the right tools, and you have to understand and empathize with their situation and figure out how to make it easy. So you got to make it easy, and you got to give them the right tools so that it's even easier. And then you got to ultimately give them the knowledge so they know what to do.
Todd, this has been amazing. I think people are walking through with a new perspective. They're maybe thinking that sounds hard.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think as our customer education people, our customer success come together and really have this open discussion of how do we make this easier for our customers? How do we help them see the results? How do we empower them to go make this happen? I think they will start to see the change in churn. They'll start to see the change in the ultimate goals that they have. Todd, as always, during SaaS therapy, we ask our audience to take on a homework assignment. I mean, no reason to go to therapy if you're not going to go work on something during the week. So, Todd, what would be the homework assignment for our audience this week?
Okay. Well, I hope so. I've had this talk with people before, and I feel like every time I've talked to a CSM about this, it usually triggers some feelings of like PTSD of like I get it,
Right?
like I see it now. So I would say the homework is simple. If your customer's overwhelmed, make it easy for them, and if they're not equipped, equip them. Give them the right thing, and that doesn't mean throw resources at them. You need to figure out a way to some way to drive change. And third, if they lack expertise, you got to teach them, and you have to empower them. You can't just teach them. You have to give them. You have to give them the right knowledge. So those three things would be my homework. Think about the fact that your customer's overwhelmed, they're not equipped, and they don't have the right expertise, and figure out how to flip that. How do you change that? That is the thing I'm most passionate about is how do we help customers feel like their life is better, easier, and they're equipped to be successful and empowered with the right knowledge and skills to be able to accomplish their dreams. Like that's the thing that's exciting about being a CSM is helping a customer unlock the value of your tools so that it is transformative for them. And so that's my ultimate challenge is go equip your customers, help them feel like their life's easier and that they know how to do it.
And Todd, I think you say it every time. They bought your software. They gave you money.
Yeah.
They want this to
They
work.
want this to work.
They want this to work. Um, they just need you to work with them.
Yeah.
And I think that was a great takeaway that I've taken from this is, do I know that the person on the other end, the pain that they're going through, the challenges that they're going through, and do I actually know how to make that easier? Do I know that the challenge that they're trying to solve for basically, I love when you usually present to somebody, you're like, my job is to get you a promotion. And the way I get you a promotion is helping you maximize the value of the software you just purchased. I mean, that's a totally different conversation. So, Todd, as always, thank you for your expertise. Thank you for improving our most important relationships, which are with our customers. Todd, it has been a pleasure for you. Thanks, everyone. Like, subscribe, give us your feedback, review us. We love doing this podcast, and we thank you, our audience, for always joining us. So thanks again for joining us with this session of SaaS Therapy with Mr. Todd Kirk and Casey Trujillo.
Thanks, everybody.
SaaS Therapy is brought to you by Brainstorm, the SaaS platform for SaaS adoption. Learn more at brainstorminc.com.